Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Ian McQuaig, and it is my pleasure to introduce and enjoy discussion between two experts on Canada's new Indo-Pacific strategy, Consul General Rana Sarkar, and also Yves Tiberghien of the University of British Columbia. I'm, full disclosure, I'm Canadian myself, so I'm happy for this group to be here. So, recognizing the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to global peace and prosperity, in November, the Government of Canada released its long-anticipated Indo-Pacific strategy. Announcing the plan, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly said that the current moment demands more of Canada. The Indo-Pacific region is now looking for us to step up our game, acting in Canada's national interests without compromising our values. Rana Sarkar has served as Consul General of Canada in San Francisco, Silicon Valley since 2017. He previously served as National Director for High Growth Markets at KPMG, and is co-chair of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Rana, his wife, Riva, and their 3 children live here in San Francisco with an oversized Labradoodle named Percy Jackson, and I'm told is a documented immigrant. Yves Tiberghien is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia, a Fulbright scholar, and earned his PhD at Stanford. He's a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and a senior fellow at the University of Alberta's China Institute. He is a prolific author and sought-after expert on all things pertaining to Asian affairs and on Canada's role in the shifting global order. In his spare time, Yves farms berries on Main Island off of Vancouver, and he likes to photograph orcas, otherwise known as killer whales, sometimes known as killer whales, and nobody asks them about their documentation status with immigration. So to kick off the discussion, Rana, why did Canada prepare the Indo-Pacific strategy, and why now?
Thank you so much, Ian, for having us and for hosting this discussion. It's always a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be on this stage. And in fact, I was just thinking about the last time I was here at the club might have been with my good friend Parag Khanna, who released a book called The Future is Asian, and which was a few books ago for him. But and the title says pretty much what you need to know about why Canada would pursue an Indo-Pacific strategy right now. And it's not just because, you know, the weight of the world has moved towards Asia, and it's no longer an emerging area, but it has emerged, and the geoeconomics and the geopolitics that have shifted as a result of its rise. And we of course know all of the numbers around, 4/5 of the global middle class and middle class growth will come out of there. It's a region that will dominate not just our global economy in the future and at the present, but it will start to dominate our psychography and start to dominate culture in all sorts of different ways. And it will no longer. And the idea of domination will not, it's not just that, things will come from Asia, but we will do things with Asia. And we'll be working together in all sorts of ways that have been unprecedented and will increasingly be more unprecedented going forward. And so this idea of the integration of the Indo-Pacific, which is, we have to thank our Japanese colleagues for bringing that word into into being. And I think it really does capture what we are, the region as a whole. But and we've had many cracks at this, and as Western countries, I think, in terms of engaging what was called, the Asia Pacific, or was called sort of the Pacific for many years, and many other terms. But this new category, I think, comes into play for a variety of reasons. And I think the principal ones are the economic growth that has emerged from that region, demographic, but also a new geoeconomics, and with that a much more assertive China, and occasionally disruptive China in the midst of that, which has changed the complexion of the geopolitical order, and has begged some big questions from other countries in terms of what a response, or what a ideal international order might be. And so we have been, at this piece of work around building a Indo-Pacific strategy with this context for many years now, and it's taken a few iterations. And what I'll say, and we'll get into this conversation with my colleague Yves here, about why are a lot of countries building Indo-Pacific strategies right now. And what do they mean? Like, what are these documents? And I have Canada's slender 23-page strategy here, which is a real distillation of a lot of work across different departments. But it also represents a sea change in the way that Canada is approaching the world. And we've seen that through the diplomatic action, not just since the current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been in power since 2015, but this has been a consistent thread, I would argue, going back decades, but has really sort of gathered steam in the last 4 to 5 years for a variety. And one of the principal reasons, I would say, and these are numbers that are incredible, since 2022, when we were all probably sitting in rooms like this, Canada has admitted 1 million new immigrants, and that's 2.7% of the population, and population growth. And that is an extraordinary number by any stretch. It's the largest immigration number going back many decades, and at that run rate, the complexion of Canada, literally and figuratively, in terms of just the way, and the demography of Canada is changing fundamentally. So 1 in 5 Canadians now can draw their lineage to the Asia Pacific. Hello, and but increasingly we are more interconnected, and not just because the majority of our diaspora communities have come in the last 20-25 years from the Asia Pacific. And those are, and what that does to a culture, over time, it pulls us, immeasurably more towards that region. And so, whereas a couple of generations ago, we could have said that we had an Indo-Pacific strategy, but it would be in the traditional categories. And I think those categories have vastly expanded in terms of where we're the touch points. It's no longer just security and economics and maybe some international assistance. And that was the traditional rubric of what a foreign affairs department would create. But now we're into very different types of engagements with a multifaceted sort of trade strategy. We've got a culture strategy. We've got engagement along climate, infrastructure, things where people, what we say is we want to meet people where they're in need and where their demands are real. And, one of the other stats that I'll just leave you with this is that the Indo-Pacific region is also home to 70% of the major natural disasters that are occurring, and we're in the midst of a changing planet right now. We're in the midst of extraordinary geoeconomic and technological change that for a variety of reasons we can get into this conversation, are anchored in, or at least the major ley lines go through the Indo-Pacific. And so this is a absolutely important time, both for internal reasons and both for external reasons, for us to be launching a Indo-Pacific strategy. So I'll leave it at that. Mm-hmm. I'm sort of remiss right now to sort of ask the next question. So I'll ask the next question of Yves. But and this was a sort of an easy one, but because Yves played a role as one of the members of the advisory group that actually drafted the Indo-Pacific strategy. And so maybe I can ask them a very blunt question as to, so what's in it, and why is it important right now?
So thank you, Rana. Thank you, Ian. It's a great pleasure and honor being here. Always a joy coming back to the Silicon Valley in San Francisco, where I spent some very happy years. Everyone has good memories, from the fog to escaping to the beach to all the intense work down on the campus. I'll also say that even though I served on the advisory committee, we had many sessions. We spent that summer working hard. We had homework, and we had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So there's not much I can say about the process there. But I could say that the overall process had multiple steps, right? There was a bureaucratic process over years, lots of consultation done by the government. Then there was the advisory committee. Then there was more happening within the government and then among the ministers in the cabinet. So we were just, the part I know is just the middle piece. And so I cannot claim any intellectual or political ownership of what's in it. But we had some great discussion. And I'm speaking purely on a personal term as an academic. So I want to say 5 things about this very special document. The first thing is Canada doesn't do strategy. And it's not like the US. If you're the US, you have this great power and you have to handle all the assets and a huge impact on the world. And basically, there's a lot of responsibility for managing the world. Canada doesn't have that burden and that habit. Maybe Canada believes in mindfulness, but focusing on the present and doing a good job today. So there are very few great strategic documents. And in terms of a strategic document covering Asia, this is the first one. Actually, there were more targeted ones in the past. There was an action plan with Japan. There was one with ASEAN. Rana knows a lot about. But this is the first big one. So in that sense, a big deal. And then it came, and it's signed by 7 cabinet ministers, actually 8 plus the prime minister. So it's a big deal too, to get all the cabinet ministers. And it comes with announceables of $2.3 billion, which is a big deal for Canada. To be credible, there's a lot of commitments there. And it moved a lot of partners. And the intended message for Canada is to say credibly that Canada is now a full spectrum, long-term partner in the Indo-Pacific. The Prime Minister said that this strategy represents a generational shift in deepening and strengthening Canada's relation in the region. And Foreign Minister Joly said that every question that matters to the future of Canada and Canadians, and I guess to some extent the same in the US, will be shaped by Canada's engagement and relation with partners in the Indo-Pacific. So there is that big piece up front. In terms of my second point is it's quite broad spectrum. When we talk later of comparative to other countries, some target on certain aspect. Canada here has taken a broad spectrum approach across 5 pillars and all regions. So there's several pieces for several sub-regions. So in terms of the content, thematically, there's 5 pillars. The first one is around promoting peace, resilience, security. And this is an explicit choice by the minister, she said so, to put it as the first pillar. She said, just what Joe and I said a long time ago, that security is what is the root of prosperity and of stability. So security, especially in a time of disruption, a time of great power competition, we're back to square one here with security. And so there's a very strong increase of commitments toward the naval presence, the security spending, with money on the table. And it's probably just the beginning. It's basically a big shift in the mindset. The second pillar is trade, and there's a lot of subparts, including a new trade gateway with Southeast Asia, work on supply chain resilience with partners, natural resource ties, etc. The third relates to people-to-people ties. So there is a commitment to increase visa capacity. And in fact, I saw today that there are new jobs being posted to hire more officers to process more efficiently all the visas. There is also 1,000 scholarships to Asian country partners. It's not like 100,000 like the US is talking about, but still a big deal for Canada. Hasn't done this in a while. There is a feminist international assistance component, and its particular target here toward Vietnam, Philippines, and Pacific Islands. The fourth pillar is climate change, fight against climate change, and the support to the transition toward a green future. So that includes major investment in sustainable infrastructure through FinDev. That's a huge part of the money that we just announced. Clean technology in places like Indonesia. And Indonesia is actually now a G7 initiative, co-led by US and Japan, and Canada is contributing big money there. Then Vietnam is another big one. And clearly here, it's in the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So now there is a G7 big credible investment that's targeting credible infrastructure with high quality requirements. And then the fifth is partnerships, with Canada pledging to be a more engaged partner with, really working with all the key countries in the region. And there are several subparts with North Pacific, Japan and Korea singled out, ASEAN, India, and there's also mention of Pacific Islands. And all this, of course, in the context of a closer relation with the US. So the US is always in the back of the mind for Canada. So the third piece here is that it's a very collaborative strategy, and focusing on long-term partnerships. Japan, Korea, US, Australia, New Zealand for security, ASEAN for green infrastructure and trade and development, India for strategic connections, Pacific Islands for development, human security, green dimensions, and feminist foreign policy. So one interesting dimension here is that Canada is well aware that we are turning into a bit of a zero-sum game in the region, and a lot of partners are uneasy with that. Especially Southeast Asia. They are trying to balance all the partners, but they don't want to be a battleground, right? So they're looking for options, they're looking for partners, and Canada is trying to be one of those partners here, understanding the situation. The fourth big point is that there is a deep component in there, which is a recalibrated, so-called realistic, updated, clear-eyed approach toward China. So there is a big piece on China. And the term that's in the strategy, page 7, is China is an increasingly disruptive global power, which was well received in the US and elsewhere. It also says that China's rise was enabled by a permissive global system, but China is looking to shape the international order into a more permissive environment for interests and values that increasingly depart from ours. And so in response to that, there is really strong language. All this is new for Canada. Canada had not stated things like this before. It says, in areas of profound disagreement, we will challenge China, including when it engages in coercive behavior, economic or otherwise, ignores human rights obligations, or undermines our national security interests and those of partners in the region. Now, there is also a subpart below that, recognizing that partners in the region don't wish for complete decoupling or conflict. And so there's an element of cooperation that remain here under the China strategy on global environmental goods, keeping a stable global economic system with the G20, or simple coexistent guardrails. So there is a particular sentence on that targeting climate change, biodiversity, global health, and nuclear proliferation. And in this regard, Canada unleashed this strategy November 27 last fall. And then in December, Canada was co-hosting with China, actually with the Chinese presidency of the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity of the UN. And it became hosted by Canada, but chaired by China. And it worked very smoothly, and it delivered the best biodiversity agreement that the planet has seen, with 23 long-term targets for very credible target by 2030 to increase the protection of the planet. And in general, I've been able to debrief with several partners, including some of the negotiators from G7 countries, and they were all praising the achievement of that conference. So somehow that worked, despite all the other tensions. And I want to single out, there's a bunch of Target 23, but Target 22 is all about human rights. And think about this, something that was co-chaired by China. It says, to ensure the full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender-responsive representation and participation in decision-making, and access to justice and information related to biodiversity by Indigenous people and local communities, respecting their cultures and their rights over lands, territories, resources, and traditional knowledge, as well as by women and girls, children and youth, and persons with disabilities, and ensure the full protection of environmental human rights defenders. So very strong. I've talked to the UN envoy on human rights and environment. He said everything we wanted is in there. So something co-chaired by Canada and China delivered that. So that's the side part here. And finally, my fifth point is, there's some specific strategies embedded in this IPS toward India, ASEAN, and the North Pacific. Our foreign minister, was hoping actually even for better relations between Japan and Korea, wanted to play a role in this, and it happened on its own, maybe thanks to the good wishes of our foreign minister. But we are watching a remarkable sort of process here between Japan and Korea that just happened. So I will leave it here, and I will turn to my question for you. Is we know that there's a lot of disruption out there. There is economic risk. There is the little banking crisis, nearby from here. There is climate change shocks. Pakistan was completely underwater. There are natural disasters. There is all kind of airplanes passing by each other. And lots of countries are wondering what to do in this environment. What can Canada contribute to those partners through this new strategy?
That's a great lead in, and I think that you, in some ways, got to the root of the response in your comments, and I think some of that is this idea that you need the word of the day, and the word of this last half decade is probably resilience. And the idea there is that the ability to absorb shock and to be able to come out of shock and be anti-fragile, which is a word that Nassim Taleb made very popular, but a few years ago. And these two ideas of being resilient and creating a resilient ecosystem, a resilient international order, that could absorb the multiplicity of shocks and the new surface areas of shock that we're seeing, and be they tech shocks as a result of the emergence of new global systems like GPT-4 and different forms of AI, to cybersecurity shocks, and to the increasing data-driven economy that represents both significant opportunities and also challenges. We discussed the multiplicity of climate shocks that people are under, and countries are facing, to the point where it's there are many countries in the Indo-Pacific that whose future in these coming decades, if not this decade, are in question as a result of rising sea levels. And so we're you mentioned a geoeconomic and a broader macroeconomic shock that, you know, we're still weeks into a banking crisis that is yet to fully resolve itself, and there are still shoes to drop as the Fed rate goes up and as global interest rates go up to fight off inflation, but are creating and potentially have the capability of creating enormous second and third order shocks to things like the commercial real estate business, to the stability of banking systems. And so all of this together, you know, what the historian Adam Tooze calls the polycrisis, all of these together require countries that are thinking across different departments. And so it's no longer a foreign affairs brief to be thinking about these. It's across the entirety of government, led by the top, to be engaged across, you know, these cross-cutting challenges. It's going to require countries that are committed to a set of values in terms of the order that they'd like to see. It's going to take a reinvestment into what used to be called the rules-based international system. And those rules are very important, and particularly when they are challenged by very powerful interests in countries that are providing an alternative to that order. And it's not to say that we cannot cooperate. You know, this world is too complex to be able to sort of parse it into one or two groups. And I don't think anybody who's a serious analyst, or, you know, as as somebody who has, you know, been engaged this, actually argues that we should be, you know, bifurcating the world necessarily. I think that, you know, there are natural divisions in the world that are coming up between, you know, countries that would like to see a more authoritarian settlement, that would like to see the world reordered along authoritarian lines, and then there's I think, you know, another group of countries, which is a much broader group of countries, that says, hang on a second, you know, it took us 150 years to develop this rules-based international order. It took a lot of blood and toil to really embed that. And we are not ready to give that up quite just yet. And there are additional, and below that, there are extraordinary upsides and value to this sort of order, which creates the substrate under which real innovation happen, which real human flourishing happen. And so our strategy is to say, not to say, you know, look at us, aren't we great? You know, here we are with this, you know, 2.3 billion / our re-engagement strategy, to say we are here to do the work. We are here to do the real hard work that it's going to take across decades to work with our partners from a place of what, you know, I would say is it's humbleness. You know, we mention our Indigenous reconciliation process. You know, another point in this is that I also happen to be the Consul General for Hawaii, and I learned a lot, you know, in this last 5 years about Hawaii and the incredible role that it plays in the Asian Pacific Island context, being smack in the middle of the Pacific. And the role that, you know, we and some of the learnings that our Indigenous groups and our experience with working with Indigenous communities might play in the Asian Pacific Island context. And that could be in, you know, sort of improving human outcomes, improving the outcomes of women and girls. But it also could be about, you know, how we protect our oceans. And so in this strategy, there's a big part of the strategy which is about oceans and ocean management and how we can work with all of our partners. And, you know, we are together with Japan there. We're together with, Indonesia there. We're together with New Zealand in this instance, working on oceans management. And so how can we use some of the tools here to promote a set of values that, not just say something is good, but show the goodness in it through the action. And so that's the real effort behind this. And we start with a place of deep engagement. That fifth pillar that you mentioned, which is about staying and making sure that we are there all along the way, because this is going to be a hard road. And I don't think anyone who's engaged in this file will tell you that the future is going to be hunky dory. It's going to be a lot of ups and downs, and to get to the place that we need to be. But we start with that principle of values. We start with that engagement across all of these different spheres, and we start with a position of humbleness. So, and I'm going to ask you a question, Yves, as to why. So we are doing this. We're in the midst of this activity, and we're not alone in this activity of putting together our Indo-Pacific strategy. A number of other countries, you mentioned earlier today when we were speaking that South Korea, came out with theirs around the same time. And we held back, to be honest, because, the world was changing. The U.S. just announced, their Indo-Pacific strategy, just over a year ago. And, we have been watching, and we have been, looking to how we could be helpful as our strategy plays into this multiplicity of strategies that are out there right now, as people start to really get their heads into what it is that we need to do for this next decade plus. And you've spent a lot of time in Japan, you've spent a lot of time in Asia. Recently, you were embedded with many people in the region. Can you give us a sense of what other countries are doing and how this fits into the context of what the US and other countries are doing?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So this Indo-Pacific strategy space can sound a little mysterious, right? A lot of people's like, what is this about? So there is at least two core pieces in there. The first one is the geographical component, right? Calling it Indo-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific. So this comes from Japan and India. They were the pioneers, and then everyone has followed. For India, the Indians claim they were first, but then Japanese claim, it depends how you count. But in India had this Go East strategy going back to 2005, which was for India to break out of the Indian Ocean and to also engage with East Asia. Now, on the Japanese side, Prime Minister Abe, going back to 2007, went to India and made the first speech mentioning Indo-Pacific. And the goal for Japan, which was sustained later when Abe was again Prime Minister, was to basically open up the space of the Asia-Pacific, which can be dominated by China, and to also recognize the growing linkages that were starting to develop with the Indian Ocean. And particularly, there was a strong desire by Japan to engage with India. So part of those efforts led to the formation of the Quad, which is the group between US, Japan, Australia, and India. So there is a geographical thing. Now, they don't all agree on what it means. Korea and Japan include Eastern Africa. Canada doesn't. US doesn't, as far as I know. So that's interesting, and then different group focus on different things. And also some, like the US, are very explicit that this is about balancing against China. Very direct. And Canada has gone quite some ways in the strategy, but not all the way. And then the others, on the other side of the spectrum, you have ASEAN. They never mention that at all, right? It's all about inclusive, peaceful prosperity. Let's all be nice to each other. And that's also called Indo-Pacific strategy. And then there's a whole range in between, right? So that's about the geography. The other big component in that space is that since I've been teaching political economy since 2000, and the field of political economy, which is all about trade and finance and globalization and all that stuff, was consciously separated from the field of security going back to the end of World War II. When the GATT was created separately from NATO, etc., there was a conscious decision by the founding fathers, mostly fathers at the time, and a few women, of the current global order, a lot of Americans, of course, to separate security and trade, for example, because when trade was too securitized, it led to dangerous dynamics, tit-for-tat dynamics like in the 1930s that can lead to a collapse of the trading system. So there was an effort to separate and have rules for security. Security is a nasty business because it's a zero-sum game, right? The increase of security of someone often affects the security of the rival. So there is, zero-sum game going on. Whereas in the economy, you can do positive-sum game. Everyone can, rise together. Well, in the last few years, we see a reconnection of security and trade and the global economy. And all this falls under that space called Indo-Pacific strategy. There's a lot of that effort. Some of it is because of the change of behavior of China. There was a good faith effort by a lot of Western countries to embed China in the global economic order on the assumption, the hope or assumption that there would be some move towards some liberal values and also that China would kind of play with the existing rules. Well, it turns out China has turned more authoritarian recently and more assertive abroad. So that has triggered a lot of reactivity, including in the US, to see the global economic engagement as a security issue. Then we have the pandemic, then we had the trade war on the Trump and Xi Jinping, now we have the issue of two industrial revolutions, the green technology revolution and the digital technology revolution, AI, and all of them use things like lithium and batteries, and suddenly it's connected to security because AI cannot be separated from security. We're going to have automatic weapons and robot killers and all this, so killer robots. So we suddenly there is a reconnection of what we have to separate from the economy and have a security angle on. And there's this concept of economic security that's growing. So the Indo-Pacific strategic space for a lot of countries is a sort of fluid exploration of that. How to secure what has to be secured without engulfing the entire global liberal system, right? Or entire global economy. So carving out certain space. And so it's an explorative space. That's why there's so much creativity in all those IPS. And that's why every country has understood that they had to play in the space, right? To be active. Because a lot of partnerships are being created, a lot of tools are being developed, a lot of mechanisms, etc. So then there is three waves of Indo-Pacific strategies. The first wave, the pioneers, that was India, Japan, and Australia. Japan was the most explicit. And actually, it's a very thoughtful strategy that's built 2016, 2018, and then the 2021 version. Amazing graphics, beautiful actually. It's very well presented. And it came around three pillars. The first one is rule of law and maritime navigation. It was partly around South China Sea, the focus. The second one is economic prosperity and infrastructure. That pillar opened the door to having China as a partner. So Japan kept a door open on the economic side there. And there was good convergence in 2019 around the G20 in Osaka, which was in Japan, and a lot of interesting cooperation between Japan and China. And then the third pillar is security. And so the first and third are kind of pushing back on Chinese assertiveness. The second one kept the door open and did not want the decoupling of the economy. So the Abe strategy was very smart, balancing out things like this. And himself, he did that. On one hand, he was building military readiness and building partnerships and selling Coast Guard ships to the Philippines and so on, and tightening with the US. On the other hand, he managed to be involved in having trade agreements with China, including RCEP, right? RCEP is the biggest trade agreement on earth. It involves 15 countries, including China and some US partners. Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand signed even though we were in the middle of the US-China trade war, and even though the US was not very happy about it.
What's that an acronym for?
A Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And the amazing part is it was signed in November 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, when there's chaos everywhere. And they did it online, hosted by Vietnam, but all those countries end up signing that agreement. And I argue that the pivot there was Japan. And it was part of the strategic vision of Abe, that on one hand, we're going to do all the deterrence, all the military readiness, security, etc., partnerships, Quad, everything. On the other hand, we're going to stabilize the economic side because Japan exports 25% of its exports to China. And so Japan cannot just decouple. Korea is 32, Australia is 43. 43 now, 2 years ago it's 45. Taiwan is 43 as well. I mean, so for them, you can't just decouple. The US, by comparison, was 11%, that's 10%. The EU is 11%. Canada is just 5%, dependent on China. So there was this balancing act. And then more recently, under Prime Minister Kishida, with the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, there has been a tilt much more toward value, asserting democratic values, asserting the more security pillars. And so that second pillar, currently, as far as I know, there's not much cooperation going on with China. We are more in a more tense period. And it's been a real shift in Japan, in terms of military as well. Japan is going to double its military expenditure over the next 5 years. And it was at 1% of military expenditure of GDP since 1955, and it's going to move to 2%. It's a historic shift of a huge magnitude. That's mostly due to Putin and Ukraine, but Kishida is afraid that the same could happen in the region, especially around Taiwan. So that's that. And then the second generation has been really with the US. So US, Europeans, UK, much more elaborate, much more security focused. And then the third wave is Canada and Korea. So they have watched what everybody's doing. And the Canadian component does have a big security piece and a security rebalancing or strengthening with, I think it's opening a process which would lead Canada to do more even down the line. And it's additional to what Canada is doing on NORAD modernization with the US. It was discussed at the recent bilateral summit. And some real change. There's a really a changing view here of the seriousness of the security situation. So there is that piece, but Canada is trying to do other things too. Work on global public goods like global environment and global health, the pandemic treaty, all kind of stuff. And work with partners on what they want. So development in South Asia, infrastructure development, and then work on values, indigenous, gender, empowerment. So Canada is doing that full spectrum, but there is a piece there, a pretty serious piece on the security side. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can jump in. I said the people and talent side of things is also, a big component of what Canada is trying to achieve, and that's just this recognition. As I said, that number earlier about 1 million new Canadians since 2022, new migrants. We are taking in hundreds of thousands, and the highest percentage of anywhere in the world right now of foreign students, many from Asia. And it's changing the complexion of not just Canada, but also, the kind of real economic patterning that's taking place, because many of these are people that will go back to region as well. And so it's really creating a kind of a new dynamic of connectivity. The question I would ask, you just from, all of these new pieces of strategy that are taking place, there's also been this new alphabet soup of new, what they call mini-lateral institutions that have grown up in the region from, you mentioned the Quad, AUKUS, which is, the UK, the United States, and Australia, which is, largely security, around the purchasing of submarines and supporting Australia's capacity, maritime capacity. But there are many others as well, including APEC, which, is an old one, which we are hosting here in San Francisco at the end of this year. How do these pieces fit together, in your view? And, it's a very creative phase, as you mentioned, but how do you see this new architecture in the region coming together?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating period of history. It's both exciting and to some extent risky, but it's also great opportunity, right? In a place like here, usually disruption is seen as a good term. In the rest of the world, disruption is a bad word, but in Silicon Valley, yeah, great, let's make disruption. So we have a confluence of shocks at and disruptions happening at the same time, right? The twin industrial revolutions, a great power transition. We have moved to a multipolar system. In 2000, the US was 31% of global GDP in nominal term. Now the US is 24%. The OECD used to be 62% in 2000. Now it's just barely 48. So we have gone down. In nominal dollars was 80, and now it's still 60, 82 and 60. In PPP, it went from 62 to 48 PPP dollars. And then we have seen the rise of China, but also the rise of the global south, right, emerging powers. So we have a big balancing process going on, moving to a multipolar world, great power transition. And we have acceleration of climate, we have systemic risks. So all this is happening at the same time. That means that every player in the world is watching this, knowing that this is an age of transition. People call it an interregnum. At least is a period where the global order that we have had is sort of eroding, and there's a need for new things, new rules and new agreements, and managing new risks. And just AI, by the way, we just had Elon Musk and another 1,000 top entrepreneurs say that AI is a human existential risk, and we need a moratorium for 6 months, right? And they're saying because in the current context, there's no governance of it, there's no rules for it, it's extremely competitive, and everyone is running ahead of the other instead of thinking how to make it safe for humanity. Some books are saying, by 2060, there will be the possibility of AI, generalized AI, non-aligned with human values, right? So we have to govern this somehow, right? We have to catch up with this. So all this is happening at the same time. So in this context, well, you could do it. One way to do it would be go back to square one and do a UN kind of process, what we call global governance. And everyone work together. Let's solve climate faster. Let's have better framework for AI. So and it was San Francisco, right? By the way, the UN is created here. So that would be great, but currently it's hard to see. We have pieces that remain. The biodiversity, we just had a treaty on the high seas, protecting the high seas. That was great, just in January. We have the G20s outside the UN, but it's still doing a few good things. So those are what's left, but a lot of pieces don't work great in the global level. So when that happens, and you need to move fast, and everyone feels risk, then you have an explosion of ideas and experiments. So I see multilateralism as a sort of explosion of competitive experiments. There's all kind of entrepreneurs, right? They are institutional entrepreneurs. Singapore has created the 3G group. AUKUS was pushed by the UK. It was the UK as entrepreneur, and then they convinced Australia, and then they convinced the US last to create AUKUS, right? Quad was the entrepreneur was Japan. So everyone is pushing something to fill a gap, and eventually things will have to be reconciled. So Canada, Canada is a cautious country. So may not have proactively engaged those things 5 years ago, for example. But now Canada is putting a lot of energy on joining IPEF. That's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is US-led and has now 15 partners, I think, because Fiji joined. But it's, Japan is key there, and a lot of Southeast Asian countries, and India is in there. But so far, the US and Japan have said, great, you can join. But so far, there's a process to go through, and we are not there yet. The TPP was a piece that was led, before, a few years ago by the US, and then the US decided to get out of it. Canada still believes in it. Japan believes in it. So this is a great tool. We're going to have expansion there with the UK joining first. Eventually, I guess, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand. And then there's the headaches because Taiwan and China have applied. I can't imagine China being able to join. There's enough countries who wouldn't do this. But so we have that. And then so AUKUS for Canada, in the first instance, is not so relevant. Canada is not in the business of nuclear submarine. But if AUKUS expands to do cybersecurity, et cetera, then Canada may try to be involved in those pieces. Maybe everything is becoming a la carte, right? Because it's experimental. The Quad, Korea would like to be quite involved, and we'll see how it happens. Now they've reconciled with Japan. at the moment. All those pieces are moving at the same time.
The multiverse of forums, everything everywhere all at once, the Oscar winner. But I notice our erstwhile moderator agitating for some questions from the floor.
Thank you. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and we have forgive me, a multiverse of questions from our audience, and some of them are quite provocative. So stay seated, please. But I can appreciate them. Here's an interesting one. People are tired of talk about values and engagement and want to hear about actual successes to alleviate human suffering. What kind of specific actions has Canada taken in the Indo-Pacific with respect to ocean management and other areas? Please enumerate them.
This is, I think month 2, I think of strategy. But look, I mean, I think that that's a very good question. I mean, I think that we're in a moment, the everything everywhere all at once sort of moment where action is going to speak louder than words. But what I would say is that this idea of values. What do we mean by values? It's not just let's support this for some form of virtue signaling purpose. We are actually, engaged in real things that mean real things to people in the region. So if we're talking about ocean management and fisheries management for something, Canada, we've got 26,000 miles of Pacific coastline. It's a, fishing first country. We know a lot about ocean management and particularly fisheries management and at the international stage. And we are in a position to support countries that are worried about fishing rights, for instance. And these are, dramatic. It's not AI, but it is, the sustenance point for so many countries in the region. We are in the position to be able to support them with AI, because this is technology-enabled support for maritime management and ocean management. And so that is a specific set of tools that we will be working with partners to bring to region to work with people on the ground and that are looking to solve a very unique set of problems that they have, because it is it's getting difficult out there in ocean management and fisheries management. And on the ocean side, we know all about the challenges of ocean, not just plastics and the acidity levels in oceans, but also the management of coastline that is eroding. And that is something that we can work with our partners in the region, big and small, so big countries and also small countries that have a stake in this, and often the biggest stake in it because it's existential for them. So those are very specific actions that we'll be taking.
I have 5 bullet points to add to this that were not mentioned, but those are actual concrete things. Number 1 was making the Biodiversity Treaty a success, and it's protecting 30% of coastal ocean by 2030. And if Canada had not picked up the ball when the Kunming process was hanging due to COVID, it would not have happened. So there's a huge mobilization around that, thanks to what Canada did. Number 2, the high seas treaties that followed in February was mostly building on data by scientists at UBC who just got the greatest environmental prize called the Nobel Environmental Prize. And they had all the data that supported the work on the ICES treaty. In fact, another UBC scientist is the UN rapporteur on environment and human rights. So we have huge involvement in pushing the global governance. Third piece, Canada also hosted Impact 5. That was in Vancouver in January, the biggest summit on ocean protection and ocean management that was co-managed with Indigenous people from the entire region. I was active in this, and I was involved with support of DFO, the Ministry of Fisheries and Ocean, in bringing 9 leaders, Indigenous Pacific leaders from remote islands, Solomon Island, Fiji, Micronesia, and Papua New Guinea, and they presented publicly all the data that they have from ancestral knowledge, and they were extremely happy. It's the first time. It was sort of a historic moment. Fourth, BC is just closing the fish farms that are polluting because they were having antibiotics and getting to the deaths of wild salmon. I'm involved as part of the conservancy on my island in tracking the well-being of orcas and the like. So there's a lot of movement here happening. And then finally, there is a piece we should add. Canada has some of the best technology in tracking illegal fishing. And so Canada has deployed a ship in Hokkaido in Japan, and is helping tracking illegal fishing around between North Korea and Japan. And I know it's been very appreciated by the Japanese, and is also shipping technology there. So on illegal, unreported fishing, Canada will really step up in the whole region.
Thanks to both of you for that. How are Canada's abundant natural resources being sought by developing countries in the Indo-Pacific region being marketed for sustainable development goals?
Well, in a number of ways. I mean, so we are, as many would know, I mean, the largest investment into Canada in recent history has been, the creation of a very large-scale LNG facility that will, the principal marketplace, and this is all in the context of an energy transition that's going to happen more rapidly than I think most people sort of have a sense of. But the principal customers for that energy security are in Asia. There will also be other projects that we'll be doing together, including on hydrogen and the creation of green hydrogen. I think there's the Japanese have been particular leaders in the hydrogen economy, something that we have been exploring significantly. In critical minerals, as many of you know, China is right now not just the producer, but also the processor of 90% of critical minerals that are used in batteries. China is the global leader in battery right now. But in order for us to meet the zero emission vehicle targets that all of us have, California, for instance, has 100% by 2030, Canada by 2035. I mean, these are big numbers. It's going to mean an extraordinary shift in and potentially between 400 to 4,000% increase in demand for things like lithium and other commodities, but also rare earth materials that sort of go into the production of batteries, depending on the battery chemistry that you're looking at. And there'll be a lot of innovation already within the battery stack that Canadian companies are working together with our partners, not just here in the United States, but also in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, towards getting to better battery chemistries. That's going to require an enormous amount of cooperation in producing some of those resources. And Canada is home to all of the critical minerals, and we are, in fact, I mean, we had the second part of this, the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, is the conversation that we're having with the United States about supporting and also working together more intensively. We had a meeting. President Biden had a historic visit to Canada just last week, and it's interesting because the theme that came out of Prime Minister Trudeau's remarks in that was that economic strategy and security strategy and climate strategy go hand in hand in hand. Like these are all integrated. And so our abundant natural resources, the principle that we bring to this in all that we do, both domestically and also abroad, is that we need to be working towards sustainable solutions, sustainable new energy global settlement. And we are, committed to doing that. And we've, done that through our climate goals, but we've also done that through action at home and have taken it. We put a price on carbon domestically, and we've just unveiled through our federal budget a significant set of incentives for decarbonization, much like the IRA here. And so there's a lot more in those buckets, but I'll leave it at that.
Maybe we should pass to the next question. That was good.
Sure.
Since
Thank
you
you.
have a stack.
I do have a stack. Is, and if so, how is the new Indo-Pacific strategy engaging with Canada's diaspora communities?
I don't know if you're. I might have spoken too much, but I do know a little bit about the diaspora communities, and so I think it's a very important point because there are so Canada has 400,000, and that's and I don't know if that number could be on the low side, Canadians living in the Indo-Pacific. And so it's not just the 7% of the Canadian population is of South Asian descent. A little bit north of that are of Chinese descent, and 1 in 5 of Canadians can draw their lineage back to the Indo-Pacific. And so there are significant diasporas both in Canada, and what I would say about the diaspora communities in Canada is that those are huge untapped assets, and for so many reasons. And and as those diaspora communities engage more into political life, into economic life, in an integrated way, we are seeing enormous benefits already. For Canadians, and that's not just small businesses working back and forth, but it's also, the heart of our public diplomacy and our cultural and personal diplomacy. That is, that's the stuff that actually binds countries and peoples together, and governments can only do so much. But it's only when you have these strong people-to-people ties that you get and you unlock that next level. And what I would say there is that we are at the beginning of a process. And so this is when I go back to Canada, I look at the airport and I see, who's out there, who's working in these buildings. This is a very different place from the place I grew up in. And, it makes me proud when I see that. And I look at those kids, because a lot of them are young. And, I look at them and think, what kind of country are they building? What kind of connectivity are they building? And so I see it as a huge asset. And there will always be challenges, with diaspora communities, because it's not just, countries trying to influence other countries via their diasporas. It's putting pressure on diaspora communities, and often, we worry a lot about what that is. And so those are challenges that we need to manage as well.
I'll just add, I agree with all that Rana said, but I'll just add, like the US, our universities are now huge generators of goodwill and network. We have a very large group of foreign students, mostly for UBC, mostly Indo-Pacific, and we cover the whole region. And they go back, many stay in Canada, many go back, and it's becoming a huge pool of people who have experienced, shared values and a great experience. Usually they come out very happy. I'm in touch with a lot of them, and it's pretty remarkable. And they're doing great. Some of them rising in all kind of governments in the Indo-Pacific region. But Canada has not been very active, using that pool. But yeah, Canada, like the US, has this huge human capital reservoir here.
We only have about a minute left, and so this last question may lead us out into our wine and hors d'oeuvres afterwards. But what does Canada's new Indo-Pacific strategy say about Canada's role in the world? Small power, medium power, ascending power, descending power?
Smart power. It's the only way you can be in this world.
Yeah. Network power, entrepreneurial power. Yeah, be part of it. There's an awareness of an age of change, disruption, that calls for entrepreneurial solutions, I think Canada wants to be part of, has a lot to offer in bringing people together, working with partners, and looking for solutions.
Yeah.
So with that, let me leave you with my thanks to Rana and Yves for a very stimulating discussion, and for everyone here in the audience at home. Hopefully you'll join us here next time. All your great questions can get answered here at Wine and Hors d'oeuvres after the reception. So this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California in its 121st year is now adjourned. Thank you.